Sometimes the most unusual stories begin in silence. And tonight, I want to tell you one of those stories. Before we drift too far, let me say this. We truly care about you and we're glad you're here. You belong in this moment, and this story belongs to you too. Wherever you are, however your day has been, you matter. We love you and we want you to feel safe. So before we step through this doorway of memory, tell us, where in the world are you listening from and what time is it there? Now take a breath, sip your coffee if you have one nearby. And let's begin. It was midnight in a small room that wasn't quite a bedroom and wasn't quite a laboratory either. A place of wires, half-finished machines, coffee rings staining the wood of an old desk. Outside the window, the stars stretched across the sky in their endless patience, but inside, a child sat awake when the rest of the world slept. His name was Rick, and even when he was very small, sleep came to him like a stranger, knocking late, staying briefly, leaving without warning. He didn't know why, not exactly. He only knew that the night felt alive in ways the day never did. His hands were small, but they were never still. Even before he could explain himself in words, he was always building, tinkering, setting things together, just to see if they might hum or glow. On that particular night, his lamp was too dim to comfort him, so he leaned closer to the scraps of metal and wires he had found, pressing them into shapes with the strange conviction of a dreamer. The room was filled with little noises, the scrape of a screwdriver too large for his hand, the tick of a clock he kept forgetting to wind, the soft hiss of his own breathing. If someone had peeked in, they might have mistaken it for play. But Rick wasn't just playing. He was searching for something he couldn't name yet. There was always that quiet question lingering in him, even at that age. Why do I feel older than the stars? He didn't think of it in words exactly, but it lived in his chest like a question mark he carried in his heartbeat. His friends at school, not that he had many, thought about games and afternoons. But Rick's mind stretched elsewhere, reaching for things beyond the horizon, for reasons why and what if. He could not explain it to anyone, and so he didn't try. He sat there, cross-legged on the floor, turning a piece of wire over and over until his eyes burned with tiredness. He should have been asleep. He knew that. But the thought of closing his eyes only brought him restlessness. It wasn't fear. Not really. It was more like longing. If he closed his eyes, he felt he might miss something. Some secret whisper the universe was waiting to share only with him. On the desk sat a small glass of milk his mother had left him, though it had gone warm. Beside it, a sandwich from earlier, half-eaten. Rick hadn't noticed he left it unfinished. But in time, sandwiches would return as a quiet motif in his life, nourishment as love. Even if he rarely said the word aloud, he adjusted the wires, connected one piece to another, and without knowing how or why, a faint hum began to rise. The sound startled him at first, a soft vibration, almost like a sigh. He bent closer, eyes wide. It was just a coil of metal and an old battery, yet somehow, impossibly, it was singing. The tone was uneven, faltering, but undeniably gentle. Rick sat back listening, his lips parting into the smallest of smiles. He had built something that didn't fight, didn't demand, didn't flash with wild colors. It just hummed. Like a lullaby from a place beyond. He touched the wires again and the pitch shifted, deepening. For a long moment he sat very still, just listening. The sound filled the room in a way silence never could. It was as if the machine itself wanted to soothe him, as if it knew that beneath his restless curiosity was a child who wanted comfort too. He didn't tell anyone about the machine that sang. It felt too fragile, too personal, like a secret friend. He kept it on his desk, humming quietly into the long nights when he could not sleep. Sometimes he imagined the stars outside could hear it too. Maybe they hummed back in their own way, in their patient glowing. This was how Rick's life began. Not with explosions, not with chaos, but with a boy too awake for his age, too restless to stay still, and a song made of wires and hope. And though he would grow into a man of brilliance and ruin, of mistakes and inventions beyond counting, this small machine carried within it the truth of who he was. Not just a mind that stretched reality, but a heart that longed for gentleness. And maybe, even then, he was already carrying the loneliness that would later shape him. For in the humming lullaby of that midnight machine, Rick could almost hear the answer to the question he carried. Why do I feel older than the stars? The stars never said. But they kept listening, and so in that small quiet lab, a child sat awake with the universe humming in his hands, not knowing yet that one day, far in the future, he would build machines not for himself, but for a nervous boy who would call him Grandpa. Machines that would not sing, but would teach him that love doesn't always speak in words. Sometimes it hums quietly in the dark, waiting for someone to notice. Rick leaned against the desk, eyelids finally heavy, the humming soothing him in a way nothing else had. For the first time in many nights he drifted, not into full sleep but into something close, a half-dream where stars bent like wires and stretched like soft light. And maybe, somewhere in the distance, the stars hummed back. And with that the night went on, quiet and endless, as a child's first invention whispered him toward rest. The machine never had a name. Rick was too young then to think in titles, too tangled in the simple wonder of what he had made. To him it was only wires and scraps, but when it sang it felt like the night itself was answering him. The humming was faint at first, like breath caught in the hollow of a seashell. It trembled in the air, uneven but warm, a lullaby stitched from nothing but curiosity. Rick leaned close, letting the sound vibrate through his skin, and for the first time in his memory he felt quiet inside. The world outside his window stretched endlessly, stars scattered like crumbs across the velvet dark. They looked so far away, yet in that moment, with the soft pulse of the machine rising and falling, Rick imagined they were close enough to hear him. Perhaps the stars, too, longed for companionship. Perhaps that was why they twinkled, flickers of lonely laughter across the void. He curled his legs beneath him on the wooden floor and rested his head against the desk, listening. It wasn't a melody in the way people sang songs, not structured, not planned, but it was enough. It soothed the ache in his chest he couldn't explain, the feeling that he had been born searching for something just out of reach, and though he would never admit it to anyone, even then Rick was a child who cried in silence. Nights when the house was dark, when his parents thought him asleep, he let tears slip without reason. Not from sadness exactly, but from that same old longing. Why am I older inside than I should be? The machine, humming faintly, didn't answer. But it stayed. And sometimes staying is the closest thing to love. He began to add to it in the nights that followed. Each evening, while the rest of the house surrendered to dreams, Rick adjusted wires, replaced scraps, tightened screws too big for his fingers. The hum grew steadier, softer, smoother. At times it wavered, like a voice about to break into words it could not find. One night Rick whispered to it, half embarrassed, "Keep going." And it did. He didn't call it an invention. He didn't run to his parents and announce what he had done. He was not searching for pride or recognition. The machine was for him, and for the silence and for the unreachable stars. It was his secret, his midnight companion. And somewhere deep inside, though he couldn't have explained it then, he knew he had stumbled into something important. Not the mechanics of wires and batteries, but the understanding that creation could be tender. That building didn't always have to mean power or proof. Sometimes it could mean comfort. Sometimes it could be a lullaby. Rick would carry that lesson far into his future, though he would forget it many times. He would bury it under explosions, equations, and reckless escapes. But the memory lived inside him, quiet as the hum of that machine, the reminder that even chaos can have a song. He placed the half-eaten sandwich his mother had left beside him and sipped at milk that had grown lukewarm. Food, he noticed, had a strange comfort of its own. Not the taste alone, but the gesture, that someone had thought of him, that someone cared enough to leave it waiting. He didn't eat to fill hunger so much as to feel that care. He didn't know it yet, but sandwiches and small comforts like coffee would one day become his language for love. Ordinary, unspoken gestures easier than words. Some nights, he held the sandwich in his hands as the machine hummed, pretending he wasn't alone, pretending the stars themselves had sat beside him at the desk, breaking bread and listening together. One evening, as the lullaby grew steadier, Rick tilted his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. He imagined the hum wrapping around him like a blanket. He thought of children in other houses, fast asleep, dreaming of simple things, running in fields, laughing with friends. He wondered why he couldn't be like them, why his mind kept racing past the limits of the town, past the clouds, past the very edges of the sky. The hum deepened, low and soft, almost like an answer. Because you are meant to stretch. Rick didn't know what stretching meant then, not in the way his life would reveal it later. But he felt it inside, this restless adaptability, this aching curiosity. A stretching mind, a stretching heart. The nights went on. The machine kept humming. Rick's parents never asked why he looked tired in the mornings, why shadows hung under his young eyes. He didn't mind. It was easier to let the world assume he was ordinary, easier to keep his secrets folded into the fabric of midnight, and so the machine became his first confidant. He spoke to it in whispers too soft for anyone to overhear. He told it of the questions he could not tell people, why he felt old in his bones, why silence hurt more than sound, why the stars seemed to carry a secret sadness. The machine didn't answer, but it listened. Listening, he would learn, was its own kind of love. Years later, when Morty would ask him a question Rick could not bear to answer, "Are you a good dad?" he would feel again the hum of that machine. The same ache, the same silence, the same answerless comfort. And maybe in that moment he would realize the machine had never been meant to sing for him alone. It had been preparing him for someone else who would need his song too. But for now, Rick was only a boy, cradling a sandwich in one hand and a humming device in the other, lulled at last into sleep he thought would never come. The stars pressed close, as if listening to his lullaby, as if bending nearer to watch a lonely child in his lab at midnight. The machine sang. The boy dreamed. And somewhere far beyond his tiny room, the universe bent just slightly, preparing itself for the man he would become. Rick grew taller, but not in the way children usually do. He stretched, yes, in the body, but even more so in the mind. His thoughts did not stay small and tidy. They stretched past what his teachers offered, past the walls of his home, past the very air that most people accepted without question. It began in simple ways. He would take apart radios, not because they were broken, but because he needed to know why they hummed. He would stare at clouds and not only see shapes, a dragon, a sandwich, a ship, but also wonder what the sky itself was made of, what secrets held it together. His classmates would laugh when he drifted off mid-conversation, but Rick wasn't ignoring them. He was just elsewhere, always stretching. The machine that sang still lived in his room, tucked against the corner of his desk. Its lullaby had grown steadier over the months. Rick had learned how to adjust the wires so it almost purred, like a cat resting at his side. Sometimes he wondered if the machine was teaching him, rather than the other way around, teaching him that patience mattered. That listening was a kind of invention too, but the stretching, that was all his own. Some nights when the house was quiet, he imagined pulling his mind outward like a thread. At first it was only make-believe, the kind of daydreams children entertain before sleep. But over time he began to feel it physically, a sense of his thoughts bending wider, softer, able to hold more than before. He stretched to understand the loneliness in his parents' voices when they thought he wasn't listening. He stretched to imagine how the neighbor's dog might feel, left alone too long in the yard. He stretched to the stars, wondering if they too ever ached for company. Empathy, curiosity, restless longing. These were the beginnings of his quirk, and they would follow him all his life, shaping him in ways he could not escape. It didn't always feel like a gift. Sometimes it hurt. When children his age forgot an insult the next day, Rick remembered, because his mind had stretched into the quiet sadness of the boy who said it. When others laughed freely, Rick sometimes felt heavy, because he could hear the unspoken fears underneath. His stretching mind brought him closer to others, but it also left him apart from them. He understood too much, too soon, and still he searched. He began writing in notebooks he kept hidden under his bed. Not equations yet, not formulas, those would come later, but questions. Long rambling lines that tangled on the page. Why do people smile when they're sad? Why do sandwiches taste better when someone else makes them? If stars are burning, why do they look so calm? If time is endless, why does it feel so short? He didn't have answers, but asking felt like breathing. On one of those nights, half dreaming against the hum of his machine, Rick whispered aloud, "Maybe my brain is broken." The machine sang back, soft and steady. He almost imagined it disagreeing. Years later, he would learn the world didn't reward stretching minds. People liked answers, not endless questions. People liked certainty, not restless longing. And yet, Somewhere in the fibers of that boyhood room, in the lullabies of that first invention, he had already chosen who he would become, not by decision but by nature. Rick Sanchez, the boy who stretched, and later the man who could not stop. There were nights he wished it would quiet down, that he could fall asleep like other kids, dream only of baseball or bicycles. But instead his mind wandered corridors of thought so wide they frightened him. What if there are other worlds? What if I could step between them? Would I still be me? Would anyone notice if I was gone? These thoughts pressed heavy on a boy too small to carry them. Yet he carried them anyway. The sandwich motif lingered too. His mother left food on the desk, his father sometimes muttering about fuel for the brain. Rick ate not out of hunger but because it tethered him, reminded him that his body was still here, even when his mind was elsewhere. Sandwiches and coffee would become his anchors, small rituals of care amid the stretching vastness, and so a quirk became a trait. What had begun as restlessness, as sleepless nights and whispered questions, grew into a pattern that shaped everything he touched. His mind stretched past limits. His heart stretched too, though he rarely admitted it. He could not unfeel the ache in others, even when he tried. He could not unsee the beauty in the ordinary, even when he scoffed at it later. Rick was becoming Rick. One evening, staring at the stars, he said quietly, "If I could stretch far enough, I'd wrap the whole sky around me." He didn't know what that meant yet, but he would. One day when Morty's small voice trembled beside him, when Summer's laughter filled the silence, when Beth's memory haunted him like a lullaby he once forgot, he would know. He would understand that stretching wasn't just about science. It was about love. Messy, flawed, unfinished love, but for now he was only a boy. A boy with too many questions, too few answers, and a machine that sang to him when the world grew too quiet. And in the stillness of midnight, as the stars listened and his heart stretched towards something unnamed, Rick Sanchez leaned back, closed his tired eyes, and let the hum cradle him again. The quirk was no longer just a quirk. It was becoming him. There was always a gap inside him. Even as a boy, Rick knew it. He couldn't name it then, couldn't draw its edges, but he felt it as surely as a missing tooth one can't stop tonguing. Some people carried childhood like a coat, warm, ordinary, stitched with familiar comforts. Rick carried his like an unfinished equation, a sum with a piece forever absent. The hum of the little singing machine helped. It kept him company in the long nights, softened the ache for something he didn't understand. But even as it soothed, the emptiness pressed at the corners of his chest, a missing place. A hunger that wasn't for food, and yet food became the language of it. His mother would leave sandwiches by the lamp on his desk, always simple. Bread, cheese, sometimes a slice of tomato if she thought he hadn't had vegetables that day. His father sometimes added coffee he wasn't supposed to drink yet, muttering something about a sharp mind needs fuel. Rick didn't complain. He drank the bitter liquid, grimaced at the taste, but felt oddly grateful. In the small ordinary act of leaving something behind for him, he recognized care. He might not have called it love, but later in life that's exactly what it would become for him. Sandwiches and coffee, gestures instead of words. He didn't know why words felt harder. His parents asked questions sometimes. "How was your day, Rick? Are you sleeping okay?" He would shrug, mumble something quick, already restless to return to his thoughts. He could take apart a radio, rebuild it from scraps, but he could not explain the missing place inside him. It was easier to eat the sandwich, drink the coffee, and let silence carry what he couldn't say. The missing place followed him to school. He sat in classrooms where the walls seemed to hum with boredom. Other children fidgeted in their seats, drawing on paper or whispering, but Rick's mind drifted past the chalkboards, past the droning voice of the teacher, into vastness. He wanted to ask questions no one else thought to ask. He wanted to stretch past the room. Yet when he tried to speak, his words came out sharp, impatient. The other kids laughed at him, or worse, ignored him. The gap widened. At recess, while others played ball, Rick would sit with his back against the fence, knees drawn to his chest, chewing the sandwich his mother had packed. He didn't taste it so much as notice it, bread against his tongue, the faint salt of cheese. Nourishment is love, a reminder that someone somewhere thought of him. It eased the ache just enough, but it never filled it. Sometimes he would imagine a friend sitting beside him, someone who asked the same endless questions, someone who stretched too. But when the bell rang and the children rushed back to class, he stood alone, brushing crumbs from his lap. The missing place lingered at night most of all, even with the singing machine humming in the corner, even with sandwiches eaten and coffee cooling on his desk. As Rick lay awake, wondering what exactly he was reaching for, stars filled the window like scattered sparks. They looked full, but he felt empty. He wondered if maybe the stars had missing places too. Holes inside their blazing cores, pieces lost to time. He whispered once, almost shyly, "Do you feel it too?" The stars twinkled back. They didn't answer, but sometimes silence can feel like agreement. As the years passed, Rick carried the missing place like a hidden scar. He grew cleverer, sharper, stretching further and further, but the ache never left him. He learned to disguise it with sarcasm, with jokes, with too loud laughter. He pretended the sandwiches were just food, the coffee just habit. He pretended the lullaby machine was just an experiment from childhood, not a secret comfort he still listened to, but deep down, he knew. The missing place in his heart was waiting for something, or perhaps someone. He would not discover who until much later, when a nervous boy named Morty would stumble into his lab and follow him into the unknown. That boy, trembling yet loyal, would press gently against the gap, not filling it entirely but softening it, making it less lonely. But all of that was still far ahead. For now, Rick was only a boy at the edge of his own restlessness, chewing on bread and cheese, staring out windows he could not step through, building machines to soothe what words could not. The missing place was part of him. It made him restless. It made him brilliant. It made him lonely, and it made him stretch one night. As he sat at his desk with the machine humming softly, Rick whispered to the silence, "If there's a hole in me, maybe it's where the universe fits in," the machine purred. The stars listened, and Rick, for the briefest of moments, believed it might be true. Morty didn't come into the story with a bang. He arrived quietly, almost awkwardly, the way shy boys often do, shoulders hunched, hands fidgeting at his sides, eyes darting between the floor and the people he didn't quite know how to face. He wasn't built for grand entrances. He was built for small hesitations, for hesitant kindness, for questions asked with more heart than confidence. Rick saw him standing in the doorway one evening. The boy had wandered into the lab as if by accident, though something in his nervous shuffle suggested he had been waiting for this moment. Rick, head bent over scattered tools, looked up. The first thing he noticed wasn't Morty's posture or his unsure voice. It was the way the boy's gaze landed everywhere except on him. Like he carried the same missing place Rick had once felt, though shaped differently. Hi, Grandpa Rick," Morty muttered. His voice trembled as though the words might fall apart before they reached their destination. Rick grunted, not unkindly. "You're up late," Morty shrugged, as if that explained everything. He had trouble sleeping sometimes, too. Trouble finding his place in a world that seemed too loud, too sharp-edged. Maybe that was the first quiet bridge between them. Two restless souls awake when others slept. Rick didn't say much at first. He wasn't good at soft greetings. Instead, he pushed aside a pile of blueprints and gestured vaguely toward a stool. Morty sat down, perching on the edge as if afraid the metal might bite. For a long while, they said nothing. Only the faint buzz of a half-finished circuit filled the air, and yet in that silence something began. Morty fiddled with his sleeves, then spoke. I don't know if I'm supposed to be here. Mom says you're complicated." He said the word as though it carried both warning and wonder. Rick smirked faintly. "She's not wrong," Morty flushed, unsure if it was a joke. Then, almost in a whisper, he added, "But I wanted to know what you do in here." The words hung in the air like fragile glass. Rick could have brushed them aside. He could have turned away, folded back into the comfort of solitude. But something about Morty's voice, the tremor, the quiet sincerity, stirred that missing place inside him. For a moment, Rick glimpsed his own childhood loneliness reflected back at him. So instead of dismissal, he leaned back in his chair and said, "I tinker. I make things. Sometimes they sing, sometimes they don't." Morty tilted his head. "Like music?" Rick chuckled, and the sound came out softer than he expected. "Sort of. Machines don't just hum wires. They hum feelings if you listen right." Morty blinked at him, half in confusion, half in awe, and Rick realized with a start that he wanted the boy to stay. That night they didn't build anything. They just talked, haltingly at first, then with the ease of two people discovering they didn't have to explain every thought. Rick found himself describing the stars in a way he hadn't in years, not as maps or coordinates, but as companions. Morty listened, wide-eyed, like each word was a secret being entrusted to him. It was during that talk that the question slipped out. "Grandpa Rick," Morty asked quietly, almost as though ashamed, "do you think you're a good dad?" The lab stilled. Even the machine seemed to fall into silence. Rick froze, his mind circling the question like an old wound reopened. He could have deflected. He could have laughed. Instead, he reached for the only truth he had: silence. His mouth twitched as if to form words, but none came. Morty lowered his gaze. "Sorry, I didn't mean—" But Rick shook his head, cutting him off gently. "Kid, that's not an easy question." Morty nodded, almost relieved that the silence had turned into something like honesty. He didn't press further. He didn't need to. Somehow the lack of an answer carried its own weight. After a moment, Rick stood, rummaged in a drawer, and without ceremony set down a sandwich in front of Morty. Bread, cheese, tomato, hastily stacked, uneven. Morty blinked at it, then smiled a little. He hadn't realized how hungry he was. The boy ate slowly, and Rick pretended not to watch. But inside, a warmth stirred. Small acts, ordinary gestures. Sometimes they were the only language love knew how to speak. Later, when Morty finally yawned and stretched, Rick walked him to the door. They said nothing of the question that had hung between them, but both felt its echo. Rick knew he hadn't answered. Morty knew he didn't need to. That night, as Rick returned to his lab, he felt the missing place inside him shift, just slightly. It didn't vanish. But it no longer felt like an endless gap. It felt like a door waiting to be opened. And Morty, nervous and soft-hearted, had found the key. It happened one evening when the lab felt too full of wires and silence. Morty was perched on the stool again, chin in his hands, watching Rick sort through half-finished machines. The boy had been there many times now, comfortable enough to no longer fidget at every creak, though still shy in his words. Rick caught his gaze once, found a question lingering there, unspoken but restless. Without warning, Rick stood. "Come on," he said, brushing crumbs of bread from his coat. Morty blinked. "Where are we going?" Rick didn't answer. He just waved a hand, a familiar gesture that meant, "Follow." They stepped through a door that hummed faintly as it opened, the air shifting as though reality itself was parting for them. Morty braced himself, expecting chaos, explosions, sharp-edged planets, strange creatures waiting to lunge. But none of that came. Instead, they emerged into stillness. The place stretched wide and endless, the cloud fields. Rolling waves of luminous vapor drifted like tides across the horizon, glowing faintly, as though starlight had melted into mist. Each cloud pulsed with a soft light, lantern-like, shifting shades of gold and violet. Above them, stars hung heavy, close enough to feel like fruit dangling from unseen branches. The air was cool and sweet, carrying a hush that wrapped around them like a blanket. Morty's mouth fell open. "Whoa!" Rick said nothing at first. He simply walked forward, hands tucked behind his back, coat brushing against his knees. His footsteps left faint ripples in the glowing clouds beneath them. Morty hurried to catch up, still staring in awe. "Grandpa Rick," Morty whispered, What is this place?" Rick tilted his head as if listening. "Not everything needs a definition, kid. Some places just—" Morty let the words sink in. It wasn't the usual explanation he expected. No equations, no long lectures. Just a simple truth. And somehow, that made the place feel even more magical. They wandered together, the lantern clouds drifting lazily around their ankles. Occasionally, one would brush against Morty's arm, leaving a faint shimmer like fireflies clinging to his sleeve. He giggled softly, almost embarrassed by the sound of his own joy. Rick caught it and, without meaning to, smiled. For a long while they walked in silence. The quiet was not empty. It was filled with the gentle hum of light, the kind of silence that doesn't press but eases. Morty glanced sideways at his grandfather. He looked smaller here somehow, not diminished, but softened, as though the vastness of the cloud fields asked him to put down the weight he usually carried. It was Morty who spoke first. "Do you come here a lot?" Rick shook his head. "Not really. Too easy to take something like this for granted if you see it too often." Morty nodded slowly. He could feel the truth of it. Some places were meant to be rare, like lullabies only sung when the world felt too heavy, or sandwiches that tasted best when someone else made them. After another stretch of quiet, Morty's voice rose again, fragile. "Grandpa Rick, are you a good dad?" The question returned like an echo, softer this time, not a demand but a wondering. Morty's eyes stayed on the lantern clouds, afraid to meet Rick's. Rick didn't stop walking. He didn't wince or deflect with a joke. Instead, he bent down and picked up a small fragment of glowing mist, letting it drift across his palm, like smoke caught in invisible glass. He handed it to Morty. The boy cupped it carefully, eyes wide at the shimmer dancing between his fingers. "Good dads," Rick said slowly, "are probably the kind of people who answer questions like that." Out loud, Morty swallowed. "And you don't?" Rick shrugged. "Not out loud." They stood together, the glow reflecting softly in their faces. Morty didn't press further. He didn't need to. Sometimes an unspoken truth feels more solid than words. When Morty finally looked up, Rick was gazing at him, not with pride, not with judgment, but with a quiet tenderness hidden beneath furrowed brows. For just a moment, Morty felt something warm settle in his chest, like the missing place inside Rick had brushed against the missing place inside him. Eventually, Rick cleared his throat. "You hungry?" Morty blinked, caught off guard, then laughed nervously. "Kinda, yeah." Rick reached into his coat and, with a casualness that seemed absurd in a glowing dream field, pulled out a sandwich wrapped in paper. He handed it over without ceremony. Morty grinned, the simplest gesture feeling suddenly like the most extraordinary. They sat together on a low drift of light, eating in companionable silence. Morty chewed thoughtfully, then asked, "Did you make this?" Rick rolled his eyes. "It's a sandwich, Morty, don't overthink it." But Morty smiled anyway, because he knew it wasn't just a sandwich. It was the kind of act Rick didn't put words to, the kind that spoke louder in silence than a dozen promises ever could. The cloud fields glowed on, lanterns drifting across a horizon that seemed infinite. When at last they returned to the lab, Morty carried the taste of bread and starlight with him. He didn't tell anyone about the adventure. It felt too sacred, too quiet to share. And Rick, alone in his chair later, found himself humming without realizing it. Not the machine's song, not a tune from memory, just a soft, absent-minded hum, like the clouds had left their glow inside him. It wasn't science. It wasn't conquest. It was something gentler, rarer. An adventure that wasn't about invention or proof. It was about care. And Morty, nervous though he was, had felt it. There are languages that never pass through the lips. Rick had always struggled with the spoken kind. Words like love, I care, you matter caught in his throat, weighted with a lifetime of silence and regret. But there were other languages, softer ones. And for him, the most faithful of them was a sandwich. It started simply enough. Morty was bent over a notebook, doodling absent-mindedly, while Rick tinkered with a device that probably didn't need fixing. The boy's stomach rumbled once, then again. He tried to stifle it, cheeks coloring with embarrassment. Rick didn't comment. He just pushed away from the workbench, rummaged in the small refrigerator wedged between coils of wire and jars of things best left unexamined, and pulled out bread, cheese, and tomatoes. The boy looked up in surprise. "Thus, Grandpa Rick, what are you doing?" Rick grunted. "What's it look like?" "Sandwich." The knife scraped softly against the cutting board. Bread stacked, cheese layered, tomato slices uneven but generous. No flourishes, no unnecessary complexity, just food assembled with a kind of quiet precision, as though it mattered. Rick set it on a plate and slid it toward Morty without ceremony. Morty blinked, then smiled a little. "Thanks," Rick shrugged, returning to his tools. But Morty's smile lingered, and for some reason Rick didn't mind. The next time it happened, it was late at night. Morty had dozed off at the lab table, head resting on his arms, soft breaths fogging the edge of a blueprint. Rick noticed the slump of his shoulders, the way exhaustion had pulled him under mid-sentence. For a long moment, Rick just stood there, a peculiar ache pressing into his chest. Then, without thinking, he made another sandwich. He left it by Morty's elbow, with a glass of water beside it. When the boy woke later, rubbing sleep from his eyes, he found the meal waiting. He didn't ask who had made it. He didn't need to, and so it became a rhythm, a ritual without announcement. Sandwiches when Morty's stomach growled, sandwiches when words grew heavy and silence stretched between them. Sometimes coffee joined, bitter for Rick, sweeter for Morty after too much sugar stirred in. Small ordinary offerings, but in them a truth: love did not always need grand gestures. It could live in the hum of a refrigerator, the scrape of a knife, the way a plate was pushed across a table without a word. Morty began to notice. He never said much about it, but he ate every sandwich slowly, thoughtfully, as if honoring its meaning. Once, after finishing, he leaned back and said softly, You don't have to do that, Grandpa Rick." Rick didn't look up from his project. "Yeah, well, I did." Morty smiled again, a small private smile that Rick pretended not to see but carried with him long after. It was Summer who caught on next. She walked into the lab one afternoon, arms folded, watching Rick set down 2 sandwiches on the workbench. "One for him, one for Morty." She raised an eyebrow, half amused, half curious. "Since when do you make food for other people?" she teased. Rick shot her a glare. "Since when do you narrate my kitchen habits?" But Summer just smirked. She knew better than to push. Instead, she took a bite of Morty's sandwich when he wasn't looking. Morty yelped in protest, but Rick noticed the way Summer chewed slowly, surprised by the taste. The motif wove deeper. Soon Morty began offering little gestures of his own. He'd bring Rick a mug of coffee when he was hunched over a project, careful not to spill. He'd sit beside him, quietly unwrapping his sandwich, and sometimes place half of it back on the plate between them, as though offering part of the gift back. Rick never took it, but the act itself meant more than words. One evening, Morty asked softly, "Do you ever make sandwiches for yourself?" Rick frowned. "What kind of question is that?" Morty shrugged. "I don't know. Just seems like you always make them for me." Rick didn't answer right away. He remembered his own childhood, the plates left on his desk, the way food had stood in for what no one could say aloud. He thought about the missing place in his heart, and how sandwiches had once been the closest thing to comfort. Now here he was repeating the ritual, but for someone else. Finally, he muttered, "Guess I don't get hungry the same way you do." Morty didn't press, but the look in his eyes said he understood. It wasn't about hunger. It was about language. In the weeks that followed, sandwiches became part of their adventures too. A folded napkin tucked into a coat pocket before stepping into impossible worlds. A snack pulled from Rick's bag after crossing through glowing fields or rivers of memory. A simple act repeated often enough to become sacred. And Morty came to see it clearly. When Rick set down a plate, when he slid it across without comment, it was never just bread and cheese. It was a message, humble but steady. I can't say it out loud, but I care. It became the motif that followed them, soft as a lullaby. Whenever Morty took that first bite, he didn't just taste food. He tasted safety, belonging, love tucked inside crust and crumb. Rick would never admit it, not in words. But every sandwich was a father's hand stretched out, saying without saying, "You matter to me." It was Summer who broke the silence most easily. Where Morty carried nervous pauses and stammered questions, Summer walked in with folded arms and a smirk ready, as if she had been preparing comebacks long before she needed them. Rick was hunched over a console when she appeared one afternoon, leaning against the lab's doorframe. "So this is where you've been hiding, figures. Smells like burnt metal and bread." Rick didn't look up. "Bread's new. Don't act like you're not jealous." Summer rolled her eyes, but her lips twitched with the beginnings of a smile. "Jealous of a sandwich?" "Yeah, that's me, Grandpa. Living the dream." Morty, already seated on the stool with a plate in front of him, tried not to laugh. He chewed quickly, eyes darting between the two of them as if waiting for sparks. But the sparks weren't dangerous. They were playful, grounding, a rhythm of teasing that softened the edges of the room. Summer stepped inside, running her hand across a cluttered workbench. "Honestly, I don't get it. Morty's in here every night, eating your crooked sandwiches like it's gourmet. Meanwhile, you're inventing, what even is this?" She picked up a small device and squinted at it. "Don't touch that," Rick barked, grabbing it back. "It's half finished. Looks like a toaster." "It's not a toaster. Then why does it have slots for bread?" Morty snorted, then clamped a hand over his mouth, shoulders shaking. Rick glared at both of them, but something in his eyes betrayed a flicker of amusement. Summer leaned against the table, folding her arms. You know, for a genius, you're kind of obvious. Sandwiches, coffee, weird little gadgets that hum lullabies. You're basically one lab coat away from being a suburban dad. Rick froze, caught off guard. He wanted to fire back, to make a sharp joke. But the words snagged on something in his chest. Morty noticed the pause, the faint furrow of his brow. Summer noticed too, but she softened her tone almost immediately. I'm just saying, maybe you're better at this whole family thing than you think. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was reflective, like the pause after a kind word you didn't expect to hear. Summer broke it with laughter. Light, unforced, filling the room with warmth Morty could never quite manage on his own. She hopped up onto the counter, swinging her legs. Anyway, don't let it go to your head. I'm only here because Mom told me to check if you two were still alive. Morty rolled his eyes. We're fine, Summer. Sure you are, she teased, ruffling his hair. I can tell by the crumbs on your shirt. Rick busied himself with the machine, but his hands moved slower than usual. He was listening, letting the sound of her laughter settle in the cracks of the lab like sunlight slipping through dusty windows. It wasn't a sound he admitted to needing, but he did. Later that evening, when Summer had gone back upstairs, Morty asked softly, Do you like when she's around? Rick grunted, keeping his eyes on a panel of blinking lights. She's loud. Morty tilted his head. But you smiled, Rick snorted. Don't get carried away, kid. Must have been indigestion. Morty chuckled, but he saw through it. He saw the way Rick's shoulders had loosened, the way his frown had eased for a little while. The truth was, Summer's presence reminded Rick of something he had almost forgotten. Family wasn't always weight and regret. Sometimes it was teasing, laughter, the way someone dared to call you out without fear. Summer didn't tread carefully around him. She poked, prodded, laughed at his rough edges, and in doing so, she proved those edges weren't sharp enough to push her away. Rick found himself replaying the sound of her laughter that night, long after the lab had gone quiet again. It wasn't Morty's soft awe or his timid questions. It was bolder, brighter, carrying a note of mischief. But beneath it was care, undeniable and grounding. He thought about Beth, his daughter, and the weight he carried there, the ways he had failed. Summer wasn't Beth, but she was her child, strong-willed, sharp, unwilling to let Rick hide behind sarcasm. In Summer, Rick saw a bridge back to something he had lost. He didn't say any of this aloud. Instead, the next time she came down to the lab, he had already made 3 sandwiches. He didn't hand them out with ceremony. He simply set them on the table one by one. Morty grinned. Summer raised an eyebrow. Huh, guess I made the cut. Rick shrugged. Don't read into it, but she did. They both did. And in that small, ordinary moment, 3 people chewing bread and cheese together in a cluttered lab, Rick felt something unfamiliar tug at the missing place in his heart. Not fullness, not completion, but closeness, the kind that comes with gentle laughter echoing against the walls of midnight. The portal rippled open with a muted shimmer, softer than usual. No loud flash, no searing light, just a gentle glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. Rick adjusted the dial on his wristband, muttering about coordinates, but his eyes betrayed a kind of curiosity Morty had seen only rarely. Where are we going this time? Morty asked, stepping cautiously closer. Rick glanced at him, lips pressed into a thin line. Someplace quiet. Don't freak out. Morty swallowed nervously and followed. The portal folded around them, and in the next breath they were standing on soil the color of faded silver. The air was cool and carried no wind, only a constant hum like whispers just at the edge of hearing. Morty turned slowly, eyes wide. The sky above was not blue or black, but translucent, as though the universe itself had peeled back a layer to reveal its veins of starlight. Shapes moved in the distance. Not creatures exactly, but echoes of thought, shadows that pulsed when someone breathed too deeply. What is this place? Morty whispered. Rick adjusted his coat, staring out across the silver plain. Planet Elysia. Locals call it the planet of whispers. Every thought that crosses your mind is spoken whether you want it or not. Morty blinked. Wait, I mean watch what you think. The moment Rick said it, Morty's chest tightened. He tried to think of nothing, but his mind betrayed him immediately. I hope I don't mess this up. The words drifted out of his mouth in a soft murmur, not shouted, but audible. Morty clapped his hands over his lips. Oh, man. Relax, Morty, that's the point of the place. Rick's voice was steady, but his eyes didn't meet his grandson's. Thoughts out loud. No hiding. They walked. The silver ground seemed endless, dotted with faint pools that rippled when approached. Morty tried to stay quiet, but his mind kept slipping. I'm scared. Rick seems different here. What if he hears something I shouldn't say? Each thought whispered into the air, trailing behind them like smoke. Morty blushed, embarrassed, but Rick didn't mock him. He didn't laugh or scold. He simply kept walking, his own silence a mystery. Then faintly Morty heard it. A whisper, not his own. I should have been better. Rick froze. His jaw clenched. He hadn't meant for it to escape, but the planet didn't care for intention. His thoughts joined the air like everyone else's. Morty's eyes widened. Rick, was that... Rick waved him off. Doesn't matter. Keep walking. But more whispers followed, quiet, almost reluctant. I miss her laugh. Too late now. Morty deserves better. Each phrase hovered in the silver air before fading like fog dissolving under the sun. Morty felt his throat tighten. He had never heard Rick sound like this. Not through words, not through drunken rants, but through the raw honesty of thought stripped bare. He wanted to reach out, to ask questions, but his own mind betrayed him again. I love you. Rick. The words slipped out before he could stop them, and they hung between them like a fragile lantern. Morty's face went red, his hands trembling. I didn't mean, I do, but not like, oh geez. Rick didn't look at him. His steps slowed, though, and Morty thought he caught the faintest hitch in his breath. Rick's whisper came softer than the rest. I know, kid. They stood there in the silence of a world where silence wasn't possible. For once, there was no alcohol to blur the truth, no machine to hide behind, no sarcasm sharp enough to cover the cracks. Only whispers, carrying what was real. Morty shifted uncomfortably, then found the courage to ask, Rick, do you ever think you're a good, dad? Or, a good grandpa? The planet answered before Rick could. Never enough. But I'm trying. Rick flinched as if betrayed by his own heart. He turned away, pulling his coat tighter. This place is a mistake, he muttered. But his voice trembled slightly and Morty caught it. They reached one of the pools, its surface reflecting not their bodies, but their memories. Morty leaned closer and saw flashes, Rick building machines in the dead of night. Beth as a child laughing before the world grew complicated. Morty himself clutching sandwiches Rick had handed him without a word. The pool whispered too. Love doesn't always look the same. Rick's hands shook. He crouched by the water, staring at the images. Stupid planet, he muttered, though his voice cracked on the last word. Morty placed a hand on his shoulder. His own thoughts whispered gently into the air. It's okay. I understand. Rick didn't push him away. For a long while they sat beside the pool, letting the whispers drift around them like a chorus of truths too heavy to carry alone. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't easy. But it was real. When they finally stepped back through the portal, leaving the silver soil behind, Morty glanced at Rick and asked softly, Are you mad that I heard? Rick lit a cigarette, staring into the smoke as if it could replace the whispers. Mad? No, just... Don't forget it, Morty. Most of the time words lie, but sometimes they slip out honest. Morty nodded. He wouldn't forget. And though Rick would never say it aloud again, Morty carried that whisper home with him, a small lantern in the dark. I'm trying. The night after their journey to the planet of whispers, Rick sat alone in the garage. Morty had fallen asleep on the couch, curled up under a blanket he'd dragged in from the living room. The hum of tools lay silent. No beakers bubbled, no sparks flew. Only the faint ticking of a clock filled the space, steady as a heartbeat. Rick nursed a cup of cold coffee, staring into the dark. His thoughts, still raw from the whispering planet, drifted towards someone he hadn't allowed himself to remember in years. Someone who had been there before the chaos, before the mistakes, before the weight of genius turned heavy. Morty stirred in his sleep. A quiet mumble slipped from his lips and Rick's gaze softened. He could hear echoes of his old mentor's words. Genius is just another kind of loneliness, unless you learn to share it. The memory pulled him under. He was young again, barely more than a boy, restless and wide-eyed, always building, always tinkering. His hands had been too small for the machines he imagined. but his mind stretched wider than the horizon. And in those years, there had been someone who saw him not just as a prodigy, not just as a mind, but as a child who needed gentleness. Her name was Ilara. She was not of Earth, not exactly. She came from a drifting colony, a place where stars were studied like poems instead of puzzles. Her voice was soft, her laughter quiet, and she carried a lantern wherever she went, filled not with fire, but with a glow that shifted colors with her mood. Ilara found him one night hunched over scraps of metal, his eyes burning with frustration. He had tried to build a machine to make the nights less silent, to chase away the ache of solitude. But the gears refused to turn, the wires sparked, and in his anger, he had nearly thrown it all aside. She placed the lantern beside his work and said simply, "Machines won't sing if you don't listen first." He scoffed at the time, muttering something sharp, but she didn't scold. She only sat with him, patient, until the fire in his chest cooled. And then, gently, she showed him how to listen, not just to the parts, not just to the math, but to the quiet space between. It was the first time he realized that brilliance was not about bending the world into shape, but about hearing the world already singing. Rick blinked out of the memory, staring at the cold coffee in his hand. His throat ached. He hadn't thought of her in decades. She had been there only briefly, a mentor, a guide, then gone like so many others. But her words lingered, etched deeper than equations, deeper than formulas. Morty shifted again, murmuring something incoherent. His face turned toward Rick as though he knew his grandfather was awake. Rick sighed, set down the cup and whispered to himself, "She was right, you know." About listening. The next morning, Morty rubbed his eyes and blinked up at Rick, who was adjusting a small contraption on the workbench. "What are you making?" Morty asked groggily. Rick smirked faintly, though it didn't carry its usual bite. "Not sure yet. Something that hums." "Something easy." Morty shuffled closer, watching. The machine was small, nothing like Rick's grand inventions. Just a collection of wires, a simple casing, and a soft crystal at the center. When Rick tapped it, a low hum filled the garage, not mechanical but almost like a voice humming a lullaby. Morty tilted his head. "That's kind of nice," Rick shrugged. "It's nothing. Just a trick." But his eyes lingered on the glow, and Morty could tell it wasn't nothing. Later that day, as they sat outside under the weak sunlight, Morty asked the question he had held back the night before. "Rick, did you ever have, like, a teacher? Someone who taught you, but not about science? About, being a person?" Rick grunted, reaching for a sandwich he'd made absent-mindedly. He handed half to Morty before answering. "Yeah, once. Didn't last long, but she mattered. What was she like?" Rick was quiet for a long while. The hum of the small machine drifted through the open garage door, soft and steady. Finally he said, "She listened. Didn't try to change me, didn't push, just listened." Morty chewed his sandwich thoughtfully. "Sounds like she cared about you." Rick's eyes flickered, caught between deflection and truth. At last he muttered, "Yeah, more than most." The boy smiled faintly. "You kinda do that with me sometimes. You don't think I notice, but I do." Rick's chest tightened. He wanted to dismiss it, to crack a joke, to change the subject. But the memory of Ilara's lantern glowed in his mind, soft and insistent. He let out a shaky breath and said nothing, which in itself was an answer. The sun slipped lower. Shadows stretched long across the driveway. And in the quiet, Morty leaned his head against Rick's arm just for a moment, just enough to say, "I see you." Rick closed his eyes. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to remember not only what he had lost, but what he had learned. And maybe, just maybe, he could pass it on. The machine's hum grew softer, almost like a lullaby, as if Ilara's lantern still glowed somewhere in the distance. The evening stretched long, painted in faded tones of violet and grey, as Rick guided Morty through another portal. This one was quieter than most, shimmering like a curtain of water. They stepped through and immediately the air shifted, warmer, softer, filled with a faint glow that clung to their skin like moonlight made tangible. They stood in a meadow that seemed alive with gentle radiance. The ground was covered not with grass, but with threads of light that bent when touched, curling like ribbons around their ankles. Overhead, the sky pulsed like a great lantern, breathing with its own rhythm. "Whoa," Morty breathed. His eyes were wide. reflecting the glow all around them. This place. It feels different. Not scary, not loud, just calm. Rick said nothing at first. He adjusted the strap of his bag, glancing around with the caution of someone who had seen too many worlds and trusted none of them. But something in his expression softened. Yeah, he murmured. Calm. They walked together through the meadow. The light bent with their steps, rippling outward like a pond. Morty trailed his fingers through the glowing threads, leaving behind faint sparks. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that slipped out unplanned, and then they saw it. A small figure crouched among the light, glowing faintly on its own. At first Morty thought it was a child. Small shoulders, delicate frame, movements unsure. But as they drew closer, he realized it wasn't human. Its skin shimmered translucent, like glass filled with fireflies. Its eyes were pools of liquid gold, wide and curious. Rick, Morty whispered, tugging his sleeve. What? What is that? Rick tilted his head, squinting. Lantern folk, rare, don't see many anymore. They're not exactly alive the way we think. More like echoes. But this one, he paused, his voice catching in his throat. This one's young. The creature lifted its gaze. It tilted its head at them, as if trying to understand. Then it rose slowly to its feet. Its glow brightened, then dimmed, pulsing in rhythm with Rick's own quiet breathing. Morty stepped forward, tentative. Hi there. The childlike being blinked. It took a step closer, then another. When it reached Morty, it lifted a hand, if it could be called that, and pressed its glowing palm against Morty's chest. For a moment, Morty felt warmth, not like heat, but like the comfort of a blanket on a cold night. He gasped softly. Rick, it's warm. Rick's hands tightened at his sides. He had seen many things, more than he could ever explain. But something about this small glowing child pierced straight through the walls he had built around himself. It reminded him of Beth's tiny hand years ago, reaching up without hesitation. The lantern child turned then, stepping toward Rick. It stopped in front of him, staring up with those liquid gold eyes. For a long moment it only looked as though searching him. Rick shifted uneasily, his usual smirk absent. What? He muttered. What are you looking at? The child raised its palm and touched Rick's chest, just as it had done to Morty. Rick froze. The warmth seeped into him, spreading through cracks he didn't know were still open. For an instant, memories flooded back. Beth's laugh, her tiny feet running across the kitchen floor, the way she used to climb into his lap without asking. Rick's breath hitched. He hadn't let himself feel this in so long. The lantern child tilted its head and began to hum. The sound was soft, melodic, almost like the lullabies Rick had tried to build into his first singing machine. The tune was wordless, but it wrapped around him like forgiveness, like home. Morty watched in awe. He had never seen Rick so still, so exposed. Rick, he whispered, it likes you. Rick swallowed hard. He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, voice low, no, Morty, it sees me. The child's glow dimmed slightly as if understanding the heaviness in his tone. Then, without warning, it stepped back, its small form flickering. Its glow began to spread outward, dissolving into the meadow like sparks carried on the wind. Wait, Morty said, reaching out. Where's it going? Rick placed a hand on Morty's shoulder. His eyes never left the fading light. They don't stay. They just pass through, like lanterns on the water. Morty's throat tightened, but it felt so real. Rick finally looked at him, and for once his expression carried no sarcasm, no mask. It was real, Morty. Sometimes the shortest things are the most real. They stood together, watching the last of the child's glow scatter across the meadow. The air felt a little emptier, but also fuller, as if something had been given to them even in its absence. When they returned home later that night, Morty kept thinking of the lantern child's warmth. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling and whispered to himself, Rick's not just... You know, Rick, he's more. He's trying. And in the garage, Rick sat with his head in his hands, the faint hum of the child's song still echoing in his chest. He didn't cry, but he came close. And maybe that was enough. The portal opened onto a hush. Instead of the usual flash and tumble into chaos, Morty found himself standing on the edge of a quiet riverbank. The water stretched wide, its surface black as glass, carrying faint ripples that glowed with a light of their own. It wasn't water as Morty knew it. No smell of algae, no chill of dampness, but something stranger, gentler. It pulsed like memory itself, fluid yet alive. Rick stepped forward and crouched near the bank, dipping 2 fingers into the dark current. When he pulled them back, tiny lights clung to his skin, flickering before fading. His face was unreadable. Morty crouched beside him. What is this place? Rick didn't look at him. The river of memory. It doesn't take you back, just shows you what lingers. Morty frowned, peering at the current. For a moment he saw only the black surface. But then slowly pictures began to bloom in the water. Faint at first, like reflections, then sharper, clearer. He saw himself younger, holding a sandwich Rick had made absent-mindedly. He remembered the moment, but here it looked softer, warmer, like a lantern lit in hindsight. "Whoa," Morty whispered. "It's like dreams, but real." Rick grunted, tossing a pebble into the water. The ripple carried another vision to the surface, a child's laugh, Beth's voice, high and sweet, echoing across a kitchen floor long ago. Morty turned quickly. "Rick, is that—" Rick's jaw tightened. "Don't." But the river was merciless in its gentleness. More memories rose unasked, like secrets slipping free. A young Rick, eyes too bright, tinkering alone in a dark garage. The hum of his first machine that sang. The glow of Ilara's lantern. Morty's breath caught. "It shows you everything, doesn't it?" Rick didn't answer. He just climbed into the small wooden boat tied to the shore, its oars already resting inside. With a jerk of his chin, he gestured for Morty to follow. They drifted out onto the river. The current pulled them silently, carrying visions with it. Morty leaned over the side, watching memory after memory shimmer beneath the surface. Some were simple, sandwiches, cups of coffee, quiet nights alone. Others were heavier, arguments, slammed doors, faces turning away. At one point, Morty saw himself as a baby, held clumsily in Rick's arms. The vision startled him. "Wait, Rick, did you hold me? I don't remember that." Rick's hands tightened around the oars. His voice came out low. "Not for long." "Not enough." The river rolled on. Another memory surfaced. Beth as a teenager, her eyes bright but guarded, standing at a doorway while Rick argued with someone unseen. The sound wasn't clear, but the hurt was. Morty felt a lump in his throat. "Rick!" Rick stared straight ahead, jaw set. "That's the thing about this place. Doesn't let you rewrite it, just plays it back." But then softer memories appeared too. Morty saw Rick late at night, setting down a sandwich beside a sleeping Beth, her homework spread out across the table. He saw Rick adjusting a blanket over her shoulders, muttering something under his breath. He saw the same small care years later, when Morty himself had dozed off after an adventure, and Rick had left a blanket over him in silence. Morty's eyes stung. You cared more than you say." Rick finally met his gaze. His eyes were heavy, haunted but honest. "Caring doesn't erase the rest, Morty. That's the curse of memory. It keeps both." The boat floated deeper, the current slowing as if the river itself wanted them to linger. Morty leaned over again, and this time the vision that surfaced was one of the lantern child, glowing softly, touching Rick's chest. The hum of its lullaby rippled in the water. Morty whispered, "It's like the river knows what matters." Rick swallowed hard. He didn't answer. They drifted in silence for a long while, watching the shimmer of memories pass like stars reflected on water. Some Rick wanted to reach for, to hold. Others he wished would sink and never rise again. But the river didn't choose, and it carried them all. Finally, Morty spoke. "Rick, I don't care if you weren't perfect. I mean, nobody is. But I see you trying. I really do." Rick's hand froze on the oar. For a moment, he didn't breathe. Then he let out a shaky exhale, almost a laugh, but too sad to be one. "Careful, Morty. This place makes people sentimental." But Morty leaned closer, resting his arm on the boat's edge. "I mean it. The river's showing me. You cared. You care now." "That's what I see." Rick turned his face away, but not fast enough to hide the flicker of relief that passed through him. The boat drifted until the current brought them back to shore. As they stepped out, the visions faded behind them, sinking into the black water as if they had never been. The river resumed its calm surface, giving nothing away. Morty stood at the bank, watching the current flow on. "Do you think the river forgets?" he asked softly. Rick lit a cigarette, staring out at the water. "No, but maybe it forgives. For a long moment they both stood there listening to the hush of the current. And though the memories weighed heavy, Morty felt lighter somehow, as if carrying them together made them less sharp. When they left, the image of the glowing river stayed with them both. And that night, as Morty drifted to sleep, he whispered to himself, "I'll remember the good parts." For both of us, they came upon the house after walking through fields of quiet mist. No signs, no roads, no explanation, only a path that seemed to appear beneath their feet, leading them forward until the outline of a structure rose through the haze. At first, Morty thought it looked ordinary. Walls of pale stone, windows dim with age, a roof that sagged slightly, as though sighing under the weight of years. But the closer they came, the more he felt it, a hush that pressed against his chest, steady and strange, like the pause before a lullaby begins. "Rick," Morty whispered. "What? What is this place?" Rick stuffed his hands into his coat pockets, eyes narrowed. "Old story. Some call it the house that listens. It doesn't echo sound, it echoes feeling. Most people can't stand it for long." Morty blinked. "You mean it hears what you feel?" "Not hears, knows, big difference." Rick's voice was gruff, but his pace slowed as they approached the door. "You'll see." The door creaked open without a touch. Inside, the air was thick with warmth, not from fire but from presence. Dust motes glowed faintly in the dim light, swirling lazily as though in no rush to settle. The furniture was simple. A wooden table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with books whose titles shifted when you tried to read them. And then it began. At first, Morty thought it was silence. But slowly he realized the stillness carried weight, like a sound too deep to name. It pressed against his chest, pulling his heart forward, coaxing the truth outward. He gasped softly. "Rick, I can feel it, like it's listening." Rick moved deeper into the room, his steps deliberate. His eyes flicked to the walls, then to the floor. He didn't speak. He didn't have to, because the house was already answering. The air shimmered faintly, and Morty felt something that wasn't his own emotion. It was Rick's, quiet, buried, but undeniable. A low thrum of regret, sharp around the edges, softened by a warmth that resisted being hidden. It was heavy but not cruel, like love wrapped in grief. Morty's eyes widened. "Rick, is this you?" Rick turned sharply, his face tense. "Don't get used to it, Morty. It's just how the place works." But Morty shook his head. He pressed a hand to the wall, where the warmth pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. "No, it's real. I can feel it. You—" His throat caught. "You care. You care more than you let on." The house deepened its echo. Morty felt a rush of tenderness so strong it made his chest ache. Images flickered in the dim light. Rick leaving a sandwich by Morty's homework, Rick glancing back at him in the middle of adventures, Rick's hand reaching out when Morty stumbled. Small acts, never spoken but heavy with meaning. Morty's voice wavered. "I always wondered if I mattered to you. If I was just, a sidekick. But this—" He looked at Rick, his eyes stinging. "This tells me—" Rick stood frozen, caught between anger and surrender. His fists clenched, then slowly loosened. He looked away, muttering, "Stupid house." But the walls pulsed gently, refusing to let him hide. And Morty felt another layer, Rick's fear. Not of monsters, not of science gone wrong, but of failing again. Of trying and coming up short. Of loving and losing. Morty stepped closer. "You don't have to say it. I already know." "The house showed me." Rick's shoulders dropped. For a moment he looked older, smaller. The weight of years etched into every line of his face. Then he reached out, resting a hand on Morty's shoulder. It was awkward, almost reluctant, but steady. The house glowed faintly in approval. They sat at the wooden table, neither speaking, because words weren't needed. The air around them pulsed softly, a rhythm that matched their breathing. Morty leaned against the chair, letting the feeling wash over him. Safety, warmth, connection. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't complete. But it was real. After a long while, Rick stood and cleared his throat. "We should go. Too much of this place, it's like staring at the sun. Burns after a while." Morty nodded, but as they walked toward the door, he looked back once more. The shelves of books seemed to shimmer, their titles forming briefly into a single phrase before fading again. Love doesn't need words. Outside, the mist curled gently, swallowing the house behind them. Morty tucked his hands into his pockets, glancing at Rick. "Thanks for bringing me here," Rick grunted. "Didn't do it for you." But Morty smiled anyway, because the house had already told him the truth. That night when Morty lay in bed, he closed his eyes and let the memory of the house's silence cradle him. For the first time in a long while, he felt no need to ask Rick if he cared. He already knew, and in the garage Rick lit a cigarette, staring into the smoke. His heart felt raw, exposed, but also lighter. The house hadn't lied. And maybe that was okay. Rick did not fall asleep easily, not even in houses that listened, not even in beds that promised rest. His mind was a restless engine, spinning and sparking long after the world went quiet. But that night, after leaving the echoing walls behind, he drifted. It was not a clean sleep, not the kind of sleep Morty tumbled into so easily. It was more like a slow sinking, the way a ship settles into the ocean, creaking and reluctant. And then he dreamed. Beth was there. Not the Beth who now stood sharp and grown, her voice edged with the wear of adulthood. No, the Beth who came to him in that dream was small again. No more than 8 years old, her hair tied in messy strands that refused to be tamed, her eyes wide with a brightness that belonged only to children. "Daddy," she said, and the sound pierced him, soft as a lullaby but aching in ways he could not name. Rick tried to answer, but his throat caught. In the dream, he wasn't the man who built machines to conquer space. He wasn't the scientist who could stretch the laws of reality. He was only a father, standing in the long grass of some impossible meadow, his daughter looking up at him with trust. "Why weren't you there?" she asked, but the words weren't sharp. They were weightless, like dandelion seeds drifting in the air. Rick's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her he had been busy, that he had been searching, that his mind had pulled him away the way tides pull ships. But none of it would matter. He knew the truth was simpler and harsher. He hadn't been enough. In the dream, he crouched down to her level. He didn't speak, but he reached out. His hand trembled, brushing her hair, and for a moment the weight of years dissolved. Beth smiled, not with forgiveness, but with a child's simple joy at being seen. She placed a small sandwich in his hand, clumsy and uneven, the way children make food with more love than skill. "I made this for you," she said. Rick stared at it. A sandwich again. That same quiet motif that haunted him. Nourishment as love. Simple acts that outlived words. He took a bite, and though the bread was stale and the filling lopsided, it tasted like the best thing he had ever eaten. In that moment, he felt a surge of warmth he had long buried. Not just guilt, not just loss, but a reminder. Once someone had loved him without condition. Once someone had looked at him not as a genius or a failure, but simply as a dad. The dream shifted. He saw Beth growing, years flickering like turning pages, her eyes hardening, her smile dimming, her voice carrying the edge of someone who had learned disappointment. He tried to reach for her, but the meadow stretched apart, widening into distance. He stumbled, calling her name, but the dream muffled his voice, carrying it away like wind scattering ashes, and then he saw Morty, standing where Beth had been. Not as her replacement, not as a cure for old regrets, but as a second chance, fragile and fleeting. Morty's eyes were nervous, his posture uncertain, yet in him was a quiet willingness to love Rick, even when Rick failed. The dream pressed on him like a weight. It whispered without words. You cannot change the past, but you can shape the present. You cannot undo, but you can do again. Rick felt his knees give. He sat in the grass, the sandwich still warm in his hands, his heart aching with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. He whispered into the dream, not sure if Beth could hear him, not sure if Morty would ever know. I wasn't good enough for you, but maybe I can try with him. The meadow faded. The grass dissolved into darkness, the child's laughter slipping away like the last note of a song. And Rick was left floating, the warmth of the sandwich still lingering, the echo of Beth's eyes still alive inside him. He woke in the garage, head tilted against his workbench, a cold cup of coffee at his side. His throat was dry, his eyes damp. He rubbed his face with the heel of his hand, muttering curses at dreams that dared to soften him. But as he stood and reached for his flask, he paused. On the bench, Morty had left a sandwich, and clumsy, uneven, the bread mismatched. A quiet echo of the dream. Rick stared at it for a long time. Then, without a word, he picked it up and ate. It didn't matter that it was imperfect. It mattered that it was given, and somewhere deep inside the dream of Beth lingered. A promise whispered in silence. to do better, even if he never said it out loud. The night after the dream of Beth, Rick found himself sitting alone in the backyard. The grass was damp with dew, the stars stretched wide above him, and the air carried that gentle, endless hush that made even a genius feel small. He didn't call Morty out to join him. He didn't pour himself into another machine. He just sat there, hands folded loosely in his lap, staring at the heavens. And though no one else would have guessed, he was thinking about time. Not time as a scientist, not as equations or paradoxes or loops, but time the way a father feels it, slipping away in the lengthening legs of a child, in the changing tone of a voice, in the way goodbyes become less hesitant and more natural. He thought of Morty, the boy who once clung to him nervously, tripping over every step, who now carried himself with a little more steadiness. The boy who once looked to him for every answer, who now sometimes dared to question him. Rick exhaled a long breath. He's gonna outgrow me. The words weren't bitter. They were soft, as though spoken into the folds of the night itself. For a long while he sat in silence. Then memories began to arrive, uninvited but gentle. Morty's laughter when they watched the cloud fields together. The way his grandson's hands had trembled, then steadied when he faced down his own fears. The sandwich, clumsy and uneven, left on Rick's workbench without a word. Every small act had become a thread in a quiet tapestry. And Rick realized something he had never admitted to himself. The adventure hadn't been about the places they traveled or the strange wonders they'd seen. It had been about Morty, about the way love had returned to him, not in grand declarations but in awkward silences and sandwiches and a boy's unshaken presence. The thought of losing that used to terrify him. But tonight, under the patient stars, it only felt natural. Morty would grow. He would build his own life. He would carry the echoes of these quiet nights forward, stitched into the fabric of who he was. And Rick would still be here, fading like starlight, content with the knowledge that something of him would remain. The back door creaked open. Morty shuffled out, rubbing his eyes, his hair mussed from sleep. "Rick, you okay?" Rick didn't look at him. He kept his gaze on the sky. "Yeah, kid. Just thinking." Morty plopped down beside him in the grass, hugging his knees. "You were out here a long time. Thought maybe you got lost or something." Rick huffed a laugh. "Lost in my own backyard?" "Nah, not this time." They sat together in silence. Morty's breathing was uneven, half asleep. Rick glanced at him from the corner of his eye. The boy's face was softer in the moonlight, his features still caught between childhood and something older. "You're gonna grow up, Morty," Rick said quietly. Morty blinked. "What? I mean, yeah, I guess. You're not always gonna be running around with your old man of a grandpa. One day you're gonna have your own things. Your own people, and Rick swallowed. The words felt heavier than usual. "I'll just be a story you tell sometimes." Morty frowned, tilting his head. "That's kinda sad." Rick shook his head. "No, it's not. It's the way it should be. The point of all this, it's not about keeping you by my side forever. It's about making sure you don't need me forever." Morty stared at him for a long moment, and then a small, shy smile curved across his lips. "I think I'll always need you a little, Rick, even if I don't say it." The words pressed against Rick's chest like a weight and a gift at once. He turned away, grumbling under his breath, but his throat tightened all the same. Above them, the stars stretched across the horizon, fragile and glowing, bending with the weight of centuries, yet refusing to break. Rick thought of how he once felt older than those stars. Tonight he only felt humbled by them. The night deepened. Morty's head slowly leaned against his shoulder, heavy with sleep. Rick didn't move him. He let the boy rest, the warmth a reminder that for now the goodbye was still far away. He whispered into the quiet, words meant for no one but the sky. "When he goes, let him carry the good. Not the mistakes, not the failures, just the good." The grass rustled in the breeze as though the earth itself had heard him. Hours later, Rick carried Morty inside, laying him gently on the couch. He stood there for a long time, watching the boy's slow breathing before turning away. His steps were heavy, but his heart was lighter than it had been in years. The slow goodbye had already begun. In quiet ways, neither of them had spoken. But for the first time, Rick didn't fear it. He welcomed it, because it meant Morty would grow strong enough to keep going, even when Rick could not. And in the stillness of that night, Rick understood something rare, peace. It was late. Though time had little meaning in the way Rick and Morty traveled, sometimes days bled into nights, nights into days, until only the quiet rhythm of their breath told them how long they had been awake. This night, though, was clear. They had landed on a ridge above a valley where the air shimmered faintly, as though even the atmosphere wanted to glow. Above them, the stars spread wide and endless, stretched across the heavens in strands of silver. Morty lay back in the grass, staring up at them. They look different here, like they're not even far away, like I could reach out and touch one. Rick grunted softly, settling down beside him. That's 'cause this planet's atmosphere bends the light, makes the stars look closer. Not a trick, just the way the sky stretches. Morty blinked, turning his head toward his grandfather. The sky stretches? Rick lit a faint, tired smile. Yeah, didn't I ever tell you? Everything stretches, Morty. People too. Morty frowned. People don't stretch, Rick. Sure they do, Rick said, folding his arms beneath his head. His voice was softer than usual, less like a lecture, more like a lullaby. When life throws too much at you, you stretch to carry it. When people change, when things hurt, you bend. Sometimes you even break a little. But stretching? He glanced at the stars, his eyes reflecting their glow. Stretching means you don't snap. You find a way to keep glowing. Morty was quiet for a while, the idea settling into him like dew soaking into the grass. Is that what you did? Stretched? Rick exhaled, long and slow. More than I thought I could. More than I wanted to. When I was a kid, I felt like I was older than the stars. Like I'd already stretched too far, like there was nothing left to bend. But somehow I kept going. Not because I was strong, just because I had to, because there were people I couldn't let go of. Morty turned back to the sky. The stars seemed to breathe, pulsing faintly as if listening. So, stretching means love. Rick gave a low chuckle. You catch on fast. Yeah, Morty, it's love. It's what makes you bend without breaking. That's what holds the stars together too, you know. Gravity, a kind of love that keeps them from flying apart. The valley below shimmered as though the earth itself agreed. Morty let the silence linger before asking, Do you think I'll stretch? When I get older? Rick's gaze softened. You already are, kid. Every time you face something scary and come back stronger. Every time you forgive me when I screw up. Every time you trust me, even when I don't deserve it. That's stretching. Morty's chest warmed at the words. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded, staring at the stars until they blurred at the edges. Rick reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a device no larger than a coin. He pressed a button, and suddenly a faint hum filled the air, a vibration that wrapped around them like a soft blanket. The stars above seemed to waver, their light bending into long arcs across the sky. Morty gasped. It's like the stars are moving, Rick smirked. Nah, just showing you what I see, how they stretch, how they bend, how they keep shining even when they're pulled apart. He tucked the device back into his pocket, the hum fading, the stars returning to their steady glow. For a while, they lay there in silence. Morty closed his eyes, letting the night hum through him. He felt small, but not in a frightening way. Small in the way that reminded him he belonged to something bigger. Rick spoke again, almost as if to himself. One day, Morty, you're gonna be out there without me. And it's gonna hurt. But if you remember anything, remember this. Stretching isn't weakness. It's the only reason anything survives. It's how stars shine. It's how people love. Morty opened his eyes, looking at him. I'll remember. Rick nodded, satisfied with the promise. He tilted his head back, closing his eyes, listening to the night. For once, he didn't feel the need to fill the silence. The lesson had been given. The rest was for Morty to carry. The stars above seemed endless, their light old and fragile, yet still stretching across the void to reach them. Rick let the image settle into his mind, knowing it would linger there long after tonight, and for Morty, lying in the grass beside the man he trusted most. The sky felt close enough to hold. The night wrapped around them gently like a lullaby without words. And though Rick's eyes eventually closed, drifting in rare and fragile peace, Morty stayed awake just a little longer, staring at the stars that stretched forever. The next morning was slow. Rick sat at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee cooling between his hands. The house was quiet, except for the soft ticking of a clock that hadn't worked in years but still pretended to. Outside, sunlight stretched across the lawn, gentle and unhurried, like it had nowhere else to be. Morty shuffled in, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. He grabbed a piece of toast and dropped into the chair across from Rick. Neither spoke at first. It was the kind of silence that felt natural, the kind that didn't need to be broken. Rick studied his grandson from behind half-closed lids. Morty was growing taller. His shoulders had begun to carry weight they hadn't before. His laugh was changing too, not the unsteady laugh of a child, but the deeper sound of someone finding his place in the world. Rick's chest tightened. He took a sip of coffee to steady himself, but the warmth only carried the thought further. He's growing and I'm still here. Somehow. Morty looked up, crumbs on his chin. What? Why are you staring at me like that? Rick snorted. Relax, Morty. Just making sure you're real. Morty rolled his eyes, but he smiled faintly and went back to eating. Rick leaned back in his chair, letting the moment linger. He thought of all the things he'd gotten wrong, with Beth, with family, with himself. He thought of the times he'd hidden behind science, buried his regrets in machines, pretended he didn't care when the truth was he cared too much. And yet, here was Morty, still showing up. Still sitting across the table, eating toast as if nothing else in the world mattered. Rick realized with a surprising gentleness that maybe this was what it meant to be a dad. Not the big speeches, not the flawless record. Just showing up. Just being here. Just trying over and over, even when it wasn't perfect. Especially when it wasn't perfect, Morty broke the quiet. Hey, Rick, do you think you're a good dad? The question hung heavy in the air. Rick's heart stumbled, but he covered it with a shrug. Good dad? I don't know if I've ever been good. But I've been here. And maybe that's enough sometimes. Morty tilted his head, thoughtful. I think you're better than you think you are. Rick's throat tightened again, and he turned away, pretending to check something on the counter. Yeah, well, don't spread that around. Got a reputation to keep. Morty laughed quietly, but the sound carried a warmth that filled the room more than sunlight could. Later that day, they walked down to the garage. Morty fiddled with some spare parts while Rick adjusted a small device on the bench. They didn't talk much, but their movements wove around each other like a quiet dance. Rick handed Morty tools without being asked. Morty set aside scraps he knew Rick would use later. Small things. Ordinary things. Yet each one was a thread in the quiet fabric of love. Rick thought of Beth again, of the sandwich in his dream, of the girl who had wanted nothing more than for her father to be present. He hadn't been then, but now with Morty and he was. Maybe that was redemption. Not fixing the past, but choosing differently in the present. Not perfection, but persistence. That night, Rick stepped outside again, staring at the stars. The memory of Morty's laughter echoed faintly in his chest. He whispered to the night almost shyly, I'm still here, still trying. Somewhere in all that mess, maybe I'm still a dad. The stars pulsed in their silent glow, as though they had heard him, and Rick let himself believe, if only for a moment, that it was enough. The night had fallen heavy and serene, wrapping the house in a hush. The only light came from the faint glow of stars, seeping through the curtains, and the small lamp that flickered in the corner of the living room. Morty sat curled up on the couch, a blanket draped loosely around his shoulders. His eyes blinked slower and slower, though he fought to keep them open, as if he feared missing some last invisible part of the evening. Rick lingered by the window, staring out into the sprawl of the night sky. He held a glass of water in one hand, not drinking it, just feeling the cool weight against his palm. His silhouette looked more tired than usual, less like the indestructible genius who barreled through dimensions, and more like an old man trying, fumbling to find a way to sit with himself. Rick? Morty's voice was small, fuzzy around the edges of sleep. Do you ever, get scared? Like what happens after all this? Rick glanced over. After what, Morty? After adventures? After life? Morty nodded, his blanket tugged up to his chin. Yeah, all of it, I don't know. Sometimes it feels too big and I don't know how to hold it all. Rick sighed, setting the glass down. He moved closer, sitting in the armchair beside the couch. His body slouched, but his gaze softened. It's not about holding it all, Morty. Nobody can. It's about finding the pieces that matter and holding on to those, even if they're small. Especially if they're small. Morty blinked, his breathing slowing. Like sandwiches, he murmured with a faint smile. Rick chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. Just like sandwiches. For a long time they sat in silence. The house creaked softly, as if it too were settling into dreams. Then, without thinking, without even noticing at first, Rick began to hum. It was low, broken, barely more than a vibration in his throat. But the sound carried a shape, a familiar pattern, the same one he had woven into wires and metal so many years ago when he built his first machine that sang. The lullaby of a boy who had been lonely, searching for comfort in the music of stars. Now, older and worn, he hummed it again, not for himself, but for Morty. The melody filled the room like a warm tide. It wasn't polished or pretty. Some notes cracked, others wandered, but it carried something truer than perfection. It carried love. Morty shifted on the couch, his eyes fluttering. His lips curved into the faintest smile. That song? Sounds familiar. Rick blinked, realizing what he was doing. For a moment, shame tugged at him, the instinct to cover it up, to pretend it was nothing. But Morty's half-dreaming smile stopped him. Instead, Rick let the tune continue, let it grow. Built a machine once, Rick said softly, almost whispering, when I was a kid. It sang this. Couldn't sleep, so I made something that would sing for me. Guess some things stick. Morty's eyes closed, his breathing evening out. The song wrapped him gently, pulling him toward dreams. Rick leaned back in the chair, the hum slipping into silence for a moment, then returning, quieter, like a heartbeat. He watched Morty's chest rise and fall beneath the blanket, steady and safe, and in that stillness Rick felt something rare. Peace. Not the peace of solving an equation or escaping a catastrophe. A different kind. The peace of presence, of being enough just as he was. The last notes of the lullaby lingered like soft starlight, fading into the corners of the room. Rick stopped humming, not because he wanted to, but because Morty had already drifted. The boy's face had gone slack with rest, his mouth parted slightly in sleep. Rick rubbed his face with one hand, muttering to himself, "Good dad, bad dad. Doesn't matter. He's asleep, ain't he? Safe, that's enough." He pulled the blanket tighter around Morty's shoulders, an absent, almost clumsy gesture, but tender all the same. The night stretched onward, and Rick stayed in the chair longer than he meant to. Not tinkering, not drinking, not running. Just staying, just being there. Somewhere in the stillness, the boy who had built a singing machine had found his song again. And somewhere in that song, the man who thought himself broken found that he was, after all, still a dad. The house was silent, but beyond its walls the universe kept moving, stretching, breathing in its endless way. The night sky pressed down like a soft blanket of velvet, woven with quiet lights. Rick sat in his chair, Morty asleep just a few feet away, and let his eyes drift upward, as though the roof itself had turned transparent. The stars shimmered, far away and eternal, and for a strange moment Rick thought they were watching him back, not judging, not demanding, just remembering. It was an old feeling, one that had lived inside him since childhood. The sense that the cosmos was keeping a kind of diary, and every small act, every sandwich made, every hum in the night, every tender silence left an imprint there. Nothing vanished completely. Not really. Morty stirred slightly under the blanket, murmuring something incoherent, but settled again. Rick smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth tugging upward in a way he rarely allowed. He thought of the lullaby he had hummed, the same tune the first machine had once sung to him. He wondered if the stars had heard it too all those years ago, when he was a boy staring at the ceiling of his tiny room, building comfort out of wires and humming circuits. And if they had, then maybe they had been carrying that song all along, holding it until tonight, when it could return to him as gently as breath, outside. The constellations bent their light across centuries, spilling memory into the present. Rick saw them not as maps of gods or heroes, but as quiet portraits of ordinary love, a father holding his child's hand, a friend offering warmth, a grandson laughing nervously beside a grandfather who never found the right words but always showed up anyway. He thought of Beth as a child, sitting in the grass asking him impossible questions. He thought of Summer's sly smile, her teasing that kept him human. He thought of Morty, timid, stumbling Morty, who had become the axis of something Rick hadn't realized he was missing, until it was too late to ignore. And then Rick thought of himself. Not the legend, not the smartest man in the universe, not the outlaw of infinite worlds, just himself. The man who once built a machine that sang. The man who poured coffee a little too strong. The man who made sandwiches when words were too hard. The stars seemed to pulse as if in answer. Rick took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. He wasn't sure if the peace he felt was real or just exhaustion. But it didn't matter. Peace is peace, however it comes. For a moment he imagined drifting upward, weightless, joining the constellations like a note sliding back into a melody. Not disappearing, just stretching like the sky itself. Stretching into memory, into the quiet corners where love lingers when everything else is gone. Morty shifted again and whispered, "Rick?" Though his eyes stayed shut, Rick leaned forward slightly. "Yeah, kid, I'm here." Morty didn't answer. His breathing returned to its rhythm, steady and calm. But Rick kept watching him, his gaze protective, his heart full of something he never admitted aloud. He whispered to the stars instead, "Don't forget him. Don't forget me. Just keep it, all of it." And the stars, in their endless, unhurried way, seemed to whisper back. They did not speak in words, but in memory, in the glow that stretched across the darkness. They remembered the sandwiches, the laughter, the mistakes, the lullabies. They remembered everything. Rick leaned back again, his body sinking into the chair. His eyelids felt heavy, his breathing slow. He wasn't afraid of sleep anymore. Not tonight. Because if the stars remembered, then nothing truly vanished. He closed his eyes, and for just a heartbeat before drifting, he felt like a child again. The boy in the quiet lab at midnight, hearing a strange little machine sing him toward rest. Only this time he wasn't alone. Morty was there, Summer was there, Beth was there, even the fragments of old mentors and old mistakes. And above them all, the sky kept singing. The song was simple, like all lullabies are. It said only this: "You are loved. You are remembered. Rest now." And Rick, who had lived a life of chaos and brilliance and unbearable weight, finally let himself believe it. The stars remembered. That was enough. The night had grown deep. The stars outside hung low, as if leaning closer to listen. Inside the quiet house, Morty slept soundly and Rick rested half-dreaming in his chair. The air itself felt hushed, as though it too had been lulled into stillness by the faint echo of the lullaby. Some stories end with doors closing, battles won, or lessons neatly tied with ribbon. But this one does not. This one simply rests, like a breath held long and then gently let go. Because not every truth needs an ending. Some simply continue, stretching on like stars across the sky. Rick would go on tinkering. Morty would go on growing. Summer's laughter would echo through the kitchen, and Beth's shadow of love and distance would remain. But in this moment, in this quiet, nothing more was required. The story could simply exhale, like the last note of a song fading into the night. The sandwiches made, the cups of coffee poured, the awkward silences, the unspoken gestures, they were enough. They were the language of love, spoken in the only way Rick truly knew how. And even if he never said it aloud, Morty knew. Somewhere deep in his chest, Morty knew. And so do we. The stars remember. The lullaby lingers. And the quiet hero's journey is not about conquering worlds or bending time. It is about showing up again and again, even when the words stumble, even when the heart aches, even when the night feels too long. Maybe Rick was never meant to be the perfect father. Maybe none of us are meant to be perfect anything. But he tried. In small, ordinary ways he tried. And in that effort, messy, clumsy human, love lived. And isn't that enough? Somewhere in another universe, or perhaps this very one, Rick still hums under his breath while he works. Somewhere Morty still tugs nervously at his sleeves, watching, learning, quietly trusting. Somewhere the first machine that sang still hums its lullaby, echoing across time. The stars hold all of it, and tonight they hold you too. So rest now. Set down the worries that cling to your chest. Let them slip away like whispers carried by wind. You do not need to hold the universe in your hands. You only need to hold what matters, and even then only for a little while. You are safe here. You are remembered here, and just as Morty was wrapped in that lullaby, you are wrapped in this story, in this gentle night, in this breath. So close your eyes. Let the softness gather around you. Let the story fade like twilight at the edge of sleep, because this is not a goodbye. Not really. It is only a rest. And with that, he stretched into the stars. Thank you for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.